Good morning and welcome to Anatomy and Physiology 1. We're going to do an introduction to A and P today, and then we're going to move on to some anatomical terms and a discussion about homeostasis. Anatomy is the study of internal and external structures of the body, so the physical pieces of the body, whereas physiology is really the study of function. How does the body work? How do the individual cells work? How do each of the organ systems work? That's all physiology. We have different levels of organization, and there's a slide at the end of this that shows those levels. It's also in your textbook. So our basic level, or our smallest level of organization, is the chemical or molecular level. Our molecules are made up of atoms, which are the smallest units of matter, and they combine to form molecules. The functional properties of the molecule is determined by the unique structure that the atoms come together to form. Then we move on to the cellular level of organization. When different atoms come together to form molecules, the molecules then come together to form different types of organelles, which are the structural and functional components of cells. So your cells are made up of molecules. So that's our second level of organization. Next week, we're going to spend the whole week looking at cellular anatomy and physiology. The third level is the tissue level. So you take a bunch of cells and add them together, and the cells that are working together to perform specific functions then create a tissue. So a tissue is a group of cells working together to perform one or more specific functions. What different tissues could you name? Think about that right now. In 2 weeks, we're going to be looking at the tissue level of organization in greater detail. Once you have tissues combining, those tissues combine to form organs. So an organ is 2 or more tissues working in combination to perform several functions. Cardiac muscle tissue is a good example. So when we have that in combination with connective tissue, we then can form the actual walls of the heart. Once we have an organ, so some organs, we have the heart, the stomach, the lung, the liver, the pancreas, intestines, etc. We can add multiple organs together, and this is going to create an organ system. So an organ system is a group of organs that interact together. So the cardiovascular system contains the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels. So those 3 things together make up the cardiovascular system. And then when we add all of the organ systems together, we create the organism. So that's the highest level of organization. That's the organism. So what we're going to be looking at is human anatomy and physiology. So the human would be the organism. You could also look at the pig. So we're doing fetal pig dissections, or simulated if you're an online student. And that dissection, in that instance, the organism would be the pig that we were looking at. So here's that other slide that I was talking about. So you can see on the lower left, we have atoms in combination to form molecules. So this is our lowest level of organization. They come together to form cells. Cells come together to form tissues. Tissues come together to form organs. Organs come together to form organ systems. And then all of these different organ systems combine to make your organism. We're going to take a look now at each of the different organ systems that we have throughout the body, look at their major organs and what their functions are. So the first system is the integumentary system. It's made up of the skin, the hair, the sweat glands, and the nails. And it's our first line of defense. It protects us against environmental hazards, protects us against bacteria, abrasions, sunlight, all these different things. It's protective. It also helps in regulating body temperature. You'll see there are many systems that all interact to regulate body temperature. And it provides our sensory information. So everything that you touch and feel is being sensed by your integumentary system and then sent to your nervous system for processing. The skeletal system is made up, we all know it's made up of our bones, right? Bones make up the skeleton, but it also includes cartilage, ligaments, and bone marrow. And its functions are to provide support and protection for other tissues, to store calcium and other minerals, and to form blood cells. That's what our bone marrow is, for the creation of blood cells. The muscular system is made up of our muscles and also our tendons. I'll tell you now and I'll remind you later that muscles are connected to bone through tendons. So a tendon connects a muscle to bone. Ligaments connect bone to bone. So you'll notice that ligaments were part of the skeletal system. Our muscle provides movement, so it moves our bones, so allows us to move in space, provides protection and support for other tissues, and generates heat to maintain body temperature. That heat generation is done through shivering. Next, we have the nervous system. It's made up of our brain and spinal cord. That's our central nervous system. And then our peripheral nerves and sense organs. It directs immediate responses to stimuli. Those are reflexes. Coordinates and moderates activities of other organ systems. So the nervous system tells every other system what to do. It's very, very important. And it provides and interprets sensory information about the external conditions. So it's always sensing what's happening outside the body and sending that information to the brain. The brain is integrating that information and sending motor commands out to the rest of the body. Those are the main systems that we're going to look at in A&P1. So we're going to do the integumentary system, the skeletal system, the muscular system, and the nervous system. And then in A&P2, we're going to move on to the rest of the systems. So the endocrine system consists of the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the pancreas, the suprarenal glands, the gonads, and there is also endocrine tissue within other systems, like the heart has endocrine tissue. And it works on directing long-term changes in the activities of organ systems. You notice that the nervous system was immediate responses. The endocrine system directs long-term changes. It adjusts our metabolic activity. That's how much energy the body is using. And it controls many structural and functional changes during development. The cardiovascular system is made up of the heart, blood, and blood vessels. This was our example earlier of an organ system. And it distributes blood cells, water, nutrients, oxygen, removes carbon dioxide from all parts of the body, removes wastes as well. And it distributes heat, which assists in the control of body temperature. That's a lot of different things already that's helping us with our body temperature. The lymphoid system is made up of the spleen, the thymus, lymphatic vessels, lymph nodes, and tonsils. And this is our immune system, our defense system. So it defends us against infection and disease and drains fluids out of all of our tissues and returns that fluid into the bloodstream so it can be returned to general circulation. The respiratory system is made up of our nasal cavities, sinuses, larynx, trachea, bronchi, lungs, and alveoli. It delivers air to the alveoli, which is where gas exchange takes place. So it's removing carbon dioxide from the bloodstream and adding in oxygen. And additionally, it's producing sounds for communication. The digestive system, most people have heard of this system. Is made up of your teeth, tongue, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. We often don't consider our liver, gallbladder, and pancreas as part of the digestive system until we've learned through A&P2. The digestive system functions to process and digest our food. We mostly know that. Absorb and conserve water, absorb nutrients from our processed food, and stores energy reserves. Our urinary system is made up of our kidneys, ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra. It's excreting waste products from the blood. Our kidneys are going to filter our blood, take that waste, and allow us to discard it in our urine. Controls our water balance. Sometimes we're urinating a lot, losing water. Sometimes we're urinating very little, holding on to all the water that we can. Stores urine prior to voluntary elimination. That's what our bladder is for. And regulates blood ion concentrations and the pH of our blood. The male reproductive system is made up of our testes, epididymis, ductus deferens, seminal vesicles, prostate gland, penis, and scrotum. Produces our sperm, our male sex cells, suspending fluids, and hormones, and it is utilized for sexual intercourse. Our female reproductive system is slightly more complicated. We have our ovaries, our uterine tubes, our uterus, vagina, labia, clitoris, and mammary glands. Produce our female sex cells, which are oocytes, and our female sex hormones. In addition, it supports our developing embryo from conception to delivery, provides milk through the mammary glands to nourish our infants, and is utilized in sexual intercourse. All right, now we're going to move on to a look at homeostasis. Homeostasis is a very important concept, and it's going to come up repeatedly throughout A&P1 and A&P2. It is the existence of a stable internal environment, and it is that environment in which your body is going to function optimally, and so therefore your body is always working to maintain balance or maintain homeostasis. The homeostatic mechanisms are going to prevent harmful changes in body composition and the internal environment within our cells. We have two types of homeostatic regulation: autoregulation, also called intrinsic regulation, and extrinsic regulation. First, we're going to look at intrinsic or autoregulation. This occurs when a cell, a tissue, an organ, or an organ system adjusts its own activities in response to some environmental change. So an example, if there's not enough oxygen level in a tissue, the cells can release chemicals that cause blood vessels to dilate, which is going to bring more blood into the area. Bringing more blood in brings more oxygen in, and therefore you have increased oxygen levels in your tissues. So it's when a specific cell or a tissue, etc., can react to a change in its local environment and create the opposing effect of that change. Extrinsic regulation means the regulation is created due to the nervous system or the endocrine system. And so the nervous system and the endocrine system both can adjust the activities of all the different systems in the body. The nervous system directs quick, short-term, and specific responses. So these are our reflexes. Like when you put your hand on a hot stove, chances are you're going to pull that hand away from that stove before you even sense that your hand is hot, because you have those reflexes of the nervous system. The endocrine system takes longer for the effects to be felt within the body, but then those effects are going to last a lot longer than the effects of the nervous system. The nervous system makes you rip your hand off that stove and then its job is done, whereas the endocrine system is going to release hormones which will go throughout the body, affect multiple tissues, and continue to affect those tissues until the levels of that hormone have dropped again. All right, so there's three parts of our homeostatic regulation. The receptor, which is sensitive to a change. The control center, which is like the command center. It's going to accept information from the receptor, process that information, and then issue a command on how the body needs to deal with the changes that the receptor has detected. And then the effector is receiving that command from the control center and carrying out that command. And so the effect or the effector is going to either oppose or enhance a particular stimulus. So this picture here is a good way to understand homeostasis. So on the left in the purple bubble, it says homeostasis, normal room temperature. So here we're looking at the temperature in a room. So we're still, homeostasis is trying to keep us at that normal level. And so this works outside the body in this instance, but we have these mechanisms inside the body for multiple different scenarios. So in this instance, we're looking at room temperature. The receptor is a thermometer. So the thermometer is basically just reading the temperature of the room. And then the thermometer sends that information to the thermostat. So the thermostat is really our control center. It's getting information from the thermometer and then sending information to the effector about what to do. So in this instance, as room temperature is rising, so from homeostasis, we're going to look upward toward our receptor, and we see that room temperature is rising. So the thermometer is detecting that and going up and up and up in temperature. So it's telling the thermostat it's getting warmer in here. The thermostat doesn't want it to be warmer in there. It wants us to be at this set room temperature. And so the thermostat tells the air conditioner to turn on. The air conditioner in this sense is the effector. So the air conditioner turns on and blows cold air into the room, which is opposing the original stimulus and therefore bringing the room temperature back to normal. When we get back to normal, our homeostatic state, then the receptor says we're normal, the control center says, okay, great, everything's normal, I don't need to issue any commands. We could have the opposite here. If the room temperature was dropping, the thermometer would tell the thermostat it's too cold in here, and the thermostat would then tell the heater to turn on. So in that example, the heater would be the effector. So the big question is, why do we care about homeostasis? And the answer is that any disruption in homeostasis can result in illness and disease. So if our body's running too hot, we can be ill. If we have too many thyroid hormones, we can be ill. If we have too much glucose in our system, we can be ill. That can cause degradation to multiple organ systems. So it's really important that everything going on within our body is happening within this very specific range. Here I'm just going to introduce you to some terms. Symptoms are subjective, things that a person comes in and tells you. So I have headaches, I have stomach aches, I feel tired. Those are all symptoms that a patient will tell you. This is the reason why I'm coming into your office. Signs are objective, measurable things. So somebody might say, my neck hurts, that's a symptom, but then we measure the range of motion of their neck and we see that they have decreased extension in their neck, so that's a sign. We could write down extension is moderately decreased. We've measured that motion and we see that that sign is present. All right, so when looking at maintaining homeostasis, this can be done through negative feedback or positive feedback. Negative feedback is our most common system in the body. We only have a few different examples of positive feedback. So negative feedback is exactly what we were looking at in room temperature control. Here, this is basically the same picture that we had before, but instead of room temperature, we're looking at body temperature. So as body temperature begins to rise, the temperature receptors in our skin, our hypothalamus, which is part of our brain, are going to detect that our body temperature is rising. It's going to send that information to the thermoregulatory center in the brain. That's the center that's in charge of regulating body temperature. And then that's going to say, wow, it's really our body's getting too warm. And the brain is going to send a signal to the sweat glands to increase secretions and the blood vessels to dilate. That brings more blood flow toward the surface, which allows us to release heat from the body. And then the combination of those two effects is going to oppose the initial stimulus and bring our body temperature back down to normal. So in negative feedback, the effect is opposing the original stimulus. Positive feedback is the opposite. In positive feedback, we are creating more of the original stimulus. So blood clotting is an example. So we have a break in blood vessel wall, which causes bleeding. Those damaged cells from the breaking vessel release chemicals, and those chemicals start to clot the blood. Additional chemicals continue to be released, creating a positive feedback loop, accelerating this blood clotting process. Once the blood clot completely plugs the break in the vessel wall, the bleeding will stop, the chemicals will cease to be released, and the clotting will stop. But we have this positive feedback loop to accelerate clotting. And we like this because we want our blood to clot quickly so that we don't bleed out from some small paper cut, right? The other positive feedback mechanism in the body is when we're in labor. When we're in labor, oxytocin is released, which creates contraction of the uterus. Contraction of the uterus creates additional release of oxytocin. And then, so we keep releasing oxytocin, creating more contractions until the baby is born. Once the baby is born, we stop releasing oxytocin, we stop contracting, and we go back to our normal state of homeostasis. This table is straight out of your book, and it shows you some different organ systems involved and the functions of each organ system in looking at maintaining homeostasis in body temperature, body fluid composition, body fluid volume, waste product concentration, and blood pressure. So you can go ahead and take a look at that, and that's a good way to understand how these mainly negative feedback loops work in our body. Now we're going to move on to looking at how do we describe the body. And when I have students in class, I usually have you perform this exercise where you are making, give you pictures with surgical incisions on them, and you partner up and you have to describe to your partner exactly where they're going to cut into this patient in order to perform this surgery. And we do this prior to learning anatomical terms, and then we do it again after learning anatomical terms. And I like this because it shows you how important it is to have a set of directions that is universal, that everybody understands. It really helps in saving the lives of these patients because we kill a lot of patients when we're first trying to describe where we're going to cut them open. And then after we learn anatomical terms, we can be much more specific about how we want to handle our patients. Superficial anatomy refers to structures that are on the body surface. So we have anatomical landmarks, which are palpable structures. That means things that we can touch or palpate. Anatomical regions, which are reference areas, and directional terms. Anatomical landmarks, we have a lot of different terms that we can use to break these down. So brachium is the term for arm. So we could then assume that the brachial artery is in the arm and the brachialis muscle is also in the arm. We're going to talk about anatomical position in a minute. Some other terms we need to know: supine means lying face up, and prone means lying face down. So it's important, say you're going to operate on your patient's abdomen, you want your patient to be lying in the supine position because it's hard to operate on their abdomen if they're laying face down. Anatomical position is the position that you see this man standing in. So you are standing with your feet together and your palms facing forward. That's really important because if you look at his thumb and his pinky finger, his thumb is farther away from the midline of his body than his pinky finger. But if we were to turn his palm facing backwards, then his thumb would be closer to the midline of the body. So it doesn't help to have two people describing things differently because the hand is in a different position. So anytime you are describing a body, you will be describing it in anatomical position. So take a minute to get up out of your seat and stand in anatomical position. So your neck and shoulders are nice and back, you're standing tall, your arms are at your sides, and your palms are facing forward. You're going to use this reference for everything else that we do going forward. So we have terms for regions of the body. Cephalon is the neck, also called the head, the cephalic region. So this is in the region of the head. Cervicis, or the cervical region, is the neck. Thoracis, or the thoracic region, is the chest. The brachium is the arm. And then you can surmise that antebrachium, anti means before, antebrachium is the forearm. Carpus is the wrist, or the carpal region. Manus is the hand, or the manual region. I always remember this by thinking about manual labor, means working with your hands, so the manus must be the hand. The abdomen is called the abdominal region. That's the whole stomach, belly area. And the lumbar region, or the lumbus, is the loin. So this is your sort of lower back region from the bottom of your rib cage to the top of your pelvis. We have different ways of describing the abdomen as well. So we have 4 abdominal pelvic quadrants, which are formed by 2 lines that are perpendicular to each other and intersect at the umbilicus, or the belly button. And the abdominal pelvic regions is more precise. We make the regions up by 2 vertical lines and 2 horizontal lines. So let's look at some examples of these. Anatomical quadrants. Here you can see we have 2 lines intersecting at the umbilicus, and they are easy: right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, and left lower quadrant. And you might notice here that the right upper quadrant is on the left side of the picture, but when we discuss a patient, we're looking at their right upper quadrant. So if this was, if you were behind this patient, it would be on their right side. Left upper quadrant is on the patient's left side. So those are the 4 quadrants. Centrally, we have the epigastric region. The umbilical region is around the belly button, the umbilicus, and then below that we have the hypogastric region. So on the upper level, on the epigastric region, to the right we have the right hypochondriac region, so that would be below the ribs, and the left hypochondriac region. Below those we have the right and left lumbar region, so that is that sort of low back, the right and left lumbar region. And then below that we have the right and left inguinal region. So what's important with these quadrants and regions is we can look at these and we can surmise where our organs are going to be located. So if we look at the liver, for example, if we wanted to look at the quadrants, the liver is mainly in the right upper quadrant, but it has a small portion in the left upper quadrant. Or if we use the regions, the liver is in the epigastric region, the right hypochondriac region, and the right lumbar region. So you see how that can be really effective in describing to somebody where you're going to find certain anatomical structures. Other anatomical terms we have are directional terms. So anterior is the front of the body, posterior is the back of the body. We can also use the terms ventral and dorsal. So anterior and ventral mean the same thing, the front side of the body. Posterior and dorsal mean the same thing, the back side of the body. Cranial or cephalic means toward the head, whereas caudal means toward the tail. We'll see that most of these have an opposite. So anterior and posterior go together. Ventral and dorsal go together. Cranial and caudal go together. Superior and inferior are opposites. Superior means above or toward the head. Inferior means below. Medial is toward the midline. Lateral is away from the midline. Proximal and distal, we use these terms when we're looking at limbs. So proximal is where toward the base of attachment. So if you're looking at the arm, the wrist is proximal to the hand, the elbow is proximal to the wrist, and the shoulder is proximal to the elbow. So we are getting closer to the attachment, which is at the shoulder. Distal is the opposite, so it's farther away from the attachment. So the elbow is distal to the shoulder, the wrist is distal to the elbow, the hand is distal to the wrist. You can also say the hand is distal to the shoulder. It is farther away from the attachment than the shoulder. And then we also have superficial, which is close to the surface of the body, and deep, which is farther away from the surface of the body. Those are going to become more important when we're looking at the muscular system and the different layers of muscle that we have. So here's some just pictures to describe what we just spoke about. So we have superior and inferior. Superior is to the top of the body, inferior would be toward the bottom of the body. Versus cranial and caudal. Cranial is toward the head, caudal is toward the tail. So caudal kind of ends at the pelvis. We wouldn't say that the knee is caudal to the hip. We would say the knee is inferior or distal to the hip. Anterior or ventral is on the front side of the body. Posterior or dorsal is on the back side of the body. We're also showing superior and inferior here, but we're also adding in proximal and distal. So proximal is closer to the attachment, distal farther away from the attachment. Medial is closer to the midline, lateral is far away from the midline. So if we go back to our discussion of anatomical position, we see that the thumb is lateral to the pinky. If our palm was facing backwards, the thumb would be medial to the pinky. So we always need to be in that anatomical position so we know where everything is. We can also use sectional anatomy. Sectional anatomy is looking at the internal organization of the body for three-dimensional objects. We use this with MRIs and CT scans to look at, we can see the front and we can see the back, but we can't see anything in between. So that's what the MRI and the CT scan does, is it looks at everything that's happening in between the front and the back of the body. We have different axes or planes that we look at that we can kind of section the body up into. So perpendicular to the long axis of the body would be a transverse or horizontal section. So we can look here, this is our transverse section, so it's separating the body into a superior portion and an inferior portion. So that's our transverse plane. Next we have our sagittal plane. So the sagittal plane is going to cut the body into a left, or this would be her right, so a right portion and a left portion. It can be a mid-sagittal section, which is straight down the midline of the body, or it could be a parasagittal section, which would be a section in that same plane, but that is not midline. That's either over to the left or over to the right. And last, we have the frontal plane. So the frontal plane separates the body into an anterior portion and a posterior portion. The last part of our lecture today and this is going to go to our pig dissection in lab this week, is a discussion of body cavities. So inside of our body, we know that we have a whole bunch of organs, but those organs are divided up into multiple different chambers. So our cavities are protecting our organs through cushioning, protecting us from shocks, and permitting size and shape changes of internal organs without disrupting surrounding tissues. So think about what internal organs you know of that change shape and size. Good ones are stomach and intestines. The bladder is going to increase with urine retention and decrease with urination. The uterus has probably the largest shape and size change when it's housing a fetus. So we have all kinds of things that are the lungs. They're going to expand when we breathe in and contract when we breathe out. The heart is going to contract in order to pump the blood. So it's going to contract and relax. So a lot of different organs are changing in size and shape. Can then be divided into the right and left pleural cavities. Those are going to house a lung. So the right pleural cavity has the right lung. The left pleural cavity has the left lung. And in between those is the mediastinum. The mediastinum contains the trachea, the esophagus, major blood vessels, and it also contains the pericardial cavity. And the pericardial cavity contains the heart. So you could say that the pericardial cavity is within the mediastinum, within the thoracic cavity, within the ventral body cavity. On the other side, we have the abdominal pelvic cavity, which contains the peritoneal cavity. This includes the abdominal cavity, which has digestive organs mainly, and the pelvic cavity, which has the bladder, reproductive organs, and the very last portion of our digestive tract. So when we do our pig dissection this week, we're going to be looking at all of these different cavities and how you can determine, you can see the separation between each of these cavities within the body. The ventral body cavity appears early in embryological development and contains all of our major organs: respiratory, cardiovascular, digestive, urinary, and reproductive system. Then our diaphragm evolves and it separates this into our thoracic cavity, which is superior, and our abdominal pelvic cavity, which is inferior. Our organs that change in shape and size, we already talked about: the stomach, the lungs, the bladder, the digestive system, the uterus. The general term for our organs are our viscera. So all of our organs are considered a viscera. All of our organs are surrounded by these moist internal spaces that are permitting that expansion while limiting movement of the surrounding tissues and preventing friction. That's a big thing, is you don't want to have friction between, say, your liver and your gallbladder, right? You don't want those to get stuck together or have friction. That's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to decrease the function of each of those individual organs. So we want things to really move freely upon one another. And the way that the cavities are separated is through serous membranes. Serous means watery. So these membranes are a two-layered membrane that secretes this sort of watery fluid. The parietal layer is the outer layer, which lines the cavity itself. And then the visceral layer is the inner layer, which is going to cover the organs. In the thoracic cavity, we have the lungs and the heart. Also, we have other associated organs of respiration, cardiovascular and lymphoid systems, the inferior portions of the esophagus, and the thymus gland. The thoracic cavity gets separated down into the right and left pleural cavities, which contain the right and left lungs, and the mediastinum, which is the central portion between the pleural cavities, and that contains the blood vessels, the trachea, the esophagus, and the thymus, as well as the pericardial cavity, which contains the heart. So here's a picture of our body cavities. So this up here where it says air balloon or balloon and airspace and the fist is punching into it, that's showing you the different layers of these membranes. So the balloon itself on the outside is the parietal layer of the membrane, and then the part that is touching the fist is the visceral layer. So in general, they don't have that much space in between them. This is just a representation to show you that space. So it's more of a virtual space in between them that's full of that serous fluid that's keeping them from adhering together or having any friction. So on the bottom right, you can see the heart in the center within the pericardial cavity, and then the right and left lung on either side within the pleural cavities, and how all of those together are within the thoracic cavity. So that's our transverse view that we were just looking at. The abdominal pelvic cavity starts below the diaphragm and goes down into the pelvis. It's divided into the abdominal cavity, which is superior, and the pelvic cavity, which is inferior. And it also contains the peritoneal cavity, or the peritoneum. The peritoneum is lined with a serous membrane, so it's one membrane that's covering the peritoneal cavity. The parietal peritoneum lines the inner surface of the body wall. That's the outer portion of the membrane. The visceral peritoneum is surrounding the enclosed organs within the peritoneal cavity. The abdominal cavity extends from the inferior surface of the diaphragm down to the superior margin of the pelvis, so between your pelvic bones and your diaphragm. It contains the liver, the spleen, the stomach, the small intestines, most of the large intestines. And the peritoneal cavity encloses most of those organs, but we do have a couple of organs that lie outside of the peritoneal cavity, though they're still within the abdominal cavity. And those are the kidneys and the pancreas. So the kidneys and the pancreas are what we call retroperitoneal organs, which means they're in the abdominal cavity, but they are behind the peritoneal membrane. When we do our fetal pig dissection, you'll be able to see the kidneys and see the peritoneal membrane lying over the top of the kidneys, and we can actually pierce through to see what that looks like. The pelvic cavity is from the bones of the pelvis down to the muscular layer that forms the floor of the pelvis. It contains the end of the large intestine, the urinary bladder, reproductive organs, and the inferior portion of the peritoneal cavity comes down into the pelvic cavity. In female, the peritoneum covers the ovaries and the uterus and the superior part of the bladder in both sexes. So that finishes out our lecture for week 1. This week in lab, we're going to be doing fetal pig dissection and learning a bunch. It's really great to get some hands-on with that. And then next week, we're going to move on to our in-depth look at cellular biology. So I hope you all have a great week, and I will see you in lab.